Hello everyone, welcome back to a new video on Annie Analyzes. I'm so happy you're here. Today we're going to talk about a mystery, and I do want to apologize for my absence for last week. Um, let's just say I have no idea where my wallet is, and I'm supposed to be going on a trip next weekend. So I don't have an ID, so I had to order an ID. And then I didn't realize this was my fault that I didn't read. I didn't realize that if my iPad and my phone are connected to the same iCloud, if I delete my photos from my iPad, it's going to delete everything off my phone. So I deleted everything off my iPad for more space. And so I lost all my pictures. And also, Honey was sick last week. So I just kind of had not so much fun. So I just needed to do nothing on Saturday and Sunday. So apologies for my absence. That was why I was gone. But today we're going to be talking about a spooky mystery. And this one, I was like a little I have no idea. There's lots of twists and turns. And I'm going to see if I can find photos. It was really hard while I was doing research to find photos of people. But I'll make sure that if I can't find people, I'll make like a little diagram so we know who people are because it gets a little crazy. Anyway, let's talk about the murder in room 1046. Okay, I'm gonna set up the scene for you. So let's close our eyes. Let's close our eyes. Imagine you're working in the 1930s at the Hotel President in Kansas City, Missouri. And you see this man check in, and he's a little odd. Some of his behaviors strike you as a little perplexing. And after this whole series of events, you find out that his phone has been off the hook for several hours. So you go to check on him. You open the door, and you find murdered. Okay, let's open our eyes. So that's what we're working with today. And let's jump in. On January 2nd, 1935, a man by the name of Roland T. Owen checked into the Hotel President in Kansas City, Missouri. He was also in the company of a man who signed the hotel registry as Don Kelso. Owen also requested an interior room that did not have a window facing the street. He was described as being between 25 and 35. He had no luggage with him, and he had a very visible scar above his ear, and he also had a really bad case of cauliflower ear. And he was said to be dressed very nicely. After the check in process was all said and done, a bellboy by the name of Robert Probst showed Owen to his room, which happened to be 1046 and it was on the 10th floor. Over the next few days, hotel staff reported very strange behavior coming from the man, and a maid by the name of Mary Soptic came to the room and Owen allowed her in to clean. Before he left the room while Mary was cleaning, he told her to please leave the door unlocked because he was expecting a friend soon. And Sopik also noted that Owen kept the blinds closed very tightly and all the lights were off except for one dim lamp. And this was also corroborated by most of the hotel staff that also had entered his room. Mary said he was either very worried about something or he was just afraid. At 4 p.m. the same day, Mary returned with fresh towels. When she knocked and opened the door, she reported that Owen was laying on the bed fully clothed. Since the hallway light was shining into the room, Mary had noticed there was a note on the bedside table that said, Dawn, I will be back in 15 minutes. Wait. This was very odd because nobody else had been seen with the man since they had checked in. The next day, around 10:30 a.m., Scheisse! The next morning, January 3rd, 1935, around 10:30 a.m., Mary had returned to Owen's room again to clean. She knocked, did not get an answer. She tried to open the door, but it was locked from the outside. When she got her key, she entered the room. She noticed that Owens was still there. He had all the lights off, and she realized that somebody had to have locked him inside the room. Owen again allowed Mary into the room to clean while he was still present. She says that the phone rang. He answered and said, No, Dawn, I don't want to eat. I'm not hungry. I just had breakfast. No, I'm not hungry. Hung up the phone, she finished her duties, and she left. Again on the same day of January 3rd, Mary returned at 4 p.m. with new fresh towels. And I bet you're wondering, why does this lady keep showing up with fresh towels and cleaning his room? So I did a little bit of looking into like hotel hospitality before what we know now. And in the 1930s is kind of when hotels were being established. So guests were expecting a level of attentiveness, like just walking into your room and having fresh towels constantly. So this is why it's a little bit more normal in the 1930s and people weren't really questioning it. So if you were wondering why it is, I just gave you a little history lesson. Anyway, at 4 p.m., she returned with fresh towels and she knocked on the door and only heard a kind of gravelly, rough voice. And she knocked and said, um, she heard somebody say, "Who is it?" And it didn't sound like Owen, the man who had originally checked in. So she said, "Fresh towels, I have fresh towels." And the man responded, "We don't need any." And this was a little confusing for Mary because she knew there were no towels in the room as she had taken them the day before. So a lot happens on January 3rd. So this is a continuation of January 3rd. And about 2 hours later, which would have been around 6 p.m., a woman by the name of Jean Owen had checked into the hotel president. And she's from a different city. So she had spent most of the day in Kansas City shopping, but she didn't feel well. So she just checked into a hotel and stayed the night. And her boyfriend also lived in Kansas City. So he came to visit her around 9:20 p.m. And she was given room 1048 and she heard a lot of commotion. She reported hearing loud talking between a man and a woman and lots of profanity. So I'm going to jump into a little bit of these elevator events, and this is where it kind of gets confusing. So I'm going to make sure to put something up here to make sure we stay on track because even when I was reading it, I was like, what is happening? My head is spinning. So, a man by the name of Charles Bloucher, he was an elevator operator. He recalled one visitor in particular the night of January 3rd. The visitor that Bloucher is referring to is a woman who had been seen at the hotel visiting guests in their room on several occasions, and most of these guests had been men. So Bloucher, along with a lot of the other staff in the hotel, believed that this woman was a prostitute. And in any of the reports I read, I did not see her name, so maybe somewhere her name has been said. So I'm just going to refer to her as the woman. So this is where it gets confusing. So buckle in. So this is during the first 3 hours of his shift, which had started at midnight. So it's about midnight to 3 or 4 a.m. And she got into the elevator. She requested to go up to floor 10 and requested to know where room 1046 was. He pointed her into the direction, and about 5 minutes later, the elevator was summoned again, and it was the same woman. She expressed some confusion, saying that the man she was there to visit wasn't in the room, and every other time he had called upon her, he was always there. She had wondered if he maybe had been in room 1024 because the lights were on in that room, and she stayed on the 10th floor for a while. But an hour and a half later, Bloucher got a signal to take the elevator to the 10th floor, and the woman was waiting again on the 10th floor, and he took her to the lobby. Okay, this part gets really confusing, so I'm just going to read my notes to make sure I get it right so I'm not confusing you. So, an hour after he had taken her to the lobby, she returned with another man and they both went to the ninth floor. And around 4:15 a.m., a call from the ninth floor had turned out to be the woman again, and this time she finally left. Bloucher went back to the ninth floor and picked up the man who told Bloucher he could not sleep and he was going for a walk. Okay, I had to take a little breather there because my microphone may or may not die. If it does, I'll lose it. Okay, anyway, let's talk about Mr. Owen, shall we? So, on the morning of January 4th, around 7 a.m., a switchboard operator in the hotel, her name was Della Ferguson, noticed that Owen's phone had been off the hook. She was preparing to call him because he had requested a wake up call. So Della sent props to the bellboy to his room to see what was happening. And the do not disturb sign was hanging off of the knob, but props ignored it and knocked several times anyway. And then he heard a voice from the inside say, "Come in, turn on the lights." How creepy! The door was locked though, and Props didn't have his key with him, so he just knocked again and yelled through the door, "Put your phone back on the hook," and returned back to Ferguson and told her that he assumed that he was drunk. So around 8:30 a.m., there was a different switchboard operator who came in after Ferguson, and she had also noticed that Owen's phone had still been off the hook. So she'd sent another bellboy named Harold Pike down to see what was going on. The do not disturb sign was still hanging from the knob, but Harold Pike knocked anyway, and the door was still locked, so he entered with his key anyway. And if you're wondering how common it was for people to just enter guest's room, like have a key and enter guest's room, privacy norms were here, let me read it verbatim. Privacy norms were less strict than today. Hotels were seen more as service oriented establishments, so staff, especially maids and bellboys, might enter to tidy up, deliver messages, light fires, or turn down beds without knocking or waiting for a response. Guests generally expected this level of attentiveness, although some also did believe it was like a invasion of their privacy. That's like how I mentioned earlier about like the towels and stuff. So that's like another added layer to them just like not walking in and just knocking and unlocking your door. So hopefully you're decent at that point. So after unlocking the door, Harold had entered the room and he noticed that Owens was laying on the bed completely naked. But again, the hallway light was shining into the room and he noticed a lot of suspiciously dark spots on the comforter. But he saw the phone was laying on the floor, so he picked it up and put it back on the side table. Shortly after 10:30 a.m., the switchboard operator noticed that Owen's phone was off the hook again. So she sent Props to the room again and he had his key. So he unlocked the door, he opens it, and he finds Owens on all fours with his head down and he looked like he had been savagely beaten. Owens was about 2 feet from the door and he was still naked. So Props finally completely entered the room, turned on the lights, and saw that there was blood all over the main room walls and the bathroom. Okay, I need to sit like this for a second because my cheeks are going numb sitting on the floor. So enjoy this angle for a little bit. Props had also noted that a chair had been turned over and the bedding was very messy. Half of it was laying on the floor and it just looked like a intense struggle had ensued. He ran downstairs, he grabbed the assistant manager, and when they went back up to the room, they tried to open the door, but would only open about 6 inches because Owen had fallen and he was trying to keep himself conscious, so he was like kind of sitting up against the door, but they couldn't open it. So finally, Owens had stood up, went into the bathroom, and sat on the edge of the bathtub. When police had finally arrived and entered the room, they said that Owens had been bound with cord around his neck, ankles, and wrists. They also said that he had further bruising around his neck, suggesting that he had been strangled. He had been stabbed more than once in the chest above his heart, and one of the wounds even punctured his lung. He had several blows to the head, which caused a skull fracture and even had additional blood splatter across the ceiling. A doctor from a Kansas City hospital named Dr. Flanders was the one to cut the cord from Owen's neck, and he had asked him who'd done this to him. And according to reports, Owens had said nobody, that he'd slipped and hit his head on the bathtub. And then Dr. Flanders came back and asked, "Were you trying to kill yourself?" And allegedly, Owens had said no, and he denied that. Shortly after this interaction, Owens had lost consciousness. He was rushed to the hospital, and unfortunately, a little after midnight on January 5th, he had passed away. Dasame, audio. When they went back to investigate the scene, they found that the blood had already dried, which suggested to investigators that the attack likely happened between 4 a.m. and 5 a.m. Something odd came out years later, and it was released by the Kansas City Magazine. It was the original medical affidavit, and it did not mention that the victim had spoken during any time of this encounter, like when they found him and they took him to the hospital. So, this is where it said it's allegedly reported that he said, like, nobody had harmed him and he wasn't trying to commit suicide. None of this is confirmed, but at about 11 p.m., a city worker named Robert Lane was driving down 13th Street, where he saw a man dressed in only an undershirt, pants, and shoes. The man ran into the street in his path and had flagged him down. When Lane stopped, the man apologized and said, "Oh, I thought you were a taxi." But then the man asked if Lane could drive him to a location where he could find a taxi. Lane allowed the man to enter his car and he said,
"You look as if you've been in it bad."
and the man told him he would kill someone else tomorrow, presumably in retaliation of what had happened to him. In the mirror, Lane saw a deep cut in this man's arm. He also noticed that the man had been cupping his arm in attempt to catch large amounts of blood. They finally arrived at a destination where this mysterious man could find a taxi, and it's reported that Lane went to the viewing of this body and he noticed that the body had the same exact scratch as the man he had picked up. So he told police that, and it was the body of Owen that they were viewing. So essentially, Lane believes that it was Owens walking through the street, looking beat up, and got into his car. And, that's the alleged sighting, the potential sighting. That's never been confirmed. So moving on. This is when the investigation finally kicked off, and while they were looking through the room, they noticed that none of Owen's belongings were found in the room. And even though he was said to have no luggage, props did say that he had a comb and a toothbrush in his coat pocket when he checked into the room. The hotel amenities were also missing. That's things like towels, soap, shampoo, and they could not find the murder weapon. But even without these items, detectives did find things under the rug near the bed, like an unsmoked cigarette, a woman's hairpin, and a necktie label for an item of clothing. They said this tag said the item of clothing was from New Jersey. There were also other items of note in the room, like a safety pin, a bottle of sulfuric acid, and pieces of the cord that were used to bind Owens. They also dusted for fingerprints, and investigators found a female fingerprint on two notable items, which were an unbroken glass in the bathroom and the telephone stand. And I don't know, maybe this is a dumb question, but can you for sure say it's a female fingerprint? I read that they said it was smaller than a man, so they assumed it was a female's fingerprint. Is that correct? Is that correct thinking? I know it's the 1930s, so hey, who knows? When police were attempting to locate a next of kin for Roland T. Owen, they were unsuccessful in finding any friends or family. This led them to believe that this was a fake name, an alias, so Roland T. Owen never existed. After the failed attempt of locating his next of kin and also not knowing his real identity, the police broadcasted his description in newspaper articles. They especially included the scar over his ear and the cauliflower ear, and a detective named Ira Johnson, who was also a former wrestler, noted that the young man's unusual underarm muscle development pointed more towards that he was also a wrestler. Of course, after this description was released, a lot of people were calling the police saying that they knew the man. But there was one woman in particular that had contacted the hotel hours after the death and asked for the description. She then responded, "That's the man. He used to live in Clinton, Missouri." She then hung up the phone, so hotel staff couldn't ask any further questions. The Kansas City police then contacted their counterparts in Clinton, Missouri, but nobody under the name of Roland T. Owen was found to be missing from Clinton. So this left the huge question of who was this man, why were they at the hotel, and who were they meeting? Finally, years later, this man's true identity has been discovered, and his name is Artemus Ogletree. He was one of three children to Leon and Ruby Ogletree. He was born in Florida in 1915, and his family had finally decided to settle down in Birmingham, Alabama. And he was one of those kids with a giant imagination, so growing into a teenager, he wanted to travel the world. When he was 18, Artemis and a group of friends were planning a trip to California. And even though his dad was a little hesitant to let this happen, his mom said, "Well, it's your dream. You might as well go live it out." But Artemis had promised to keep in contact with his family with updates of letters, and he was also requesting wire transfers of money. The odd thing about the letters is they continued into 1935, so his family had no idea that he had one been missing or murdered, and it also meant that somebody had been pretending to be Artemis and was still sending the letters. Okay, now that we know the true identity of this man, let's talk about how we got there. So, in March 1935, authorities had announced that the unidentified man from the murder of hotel president, who identified himself as Roland Owen, was set to be buried, and his funeral was taking place in Melody, Melody McGilly Melody McGilly Chapel later that week. This is where things get a little bit more twisted and confusing. Obviously, it's the 1930s, so it's hard to substantiate some claims without a lot of evidence. So I'll try to keep it as simple as possible. So, after this announcement of the body being buried and having a funeral, an editor of a newspaper received a call, and on the other line was a woman who said, "You have a story in your paper that is wrong. Roland Owen will not be buried in a grave. Arrangements have been made for his funeral." Obviously, the editor was very confused, but after all of his questions, the woman kind of just ignored him. But one that got answered was, "What happened to Owen at the hotel?" And all she said was, "He got into a jam," and she hung up. So who knows who that woman is? Who knows if she's being honest? We'll never know. And at about the same time that the editor had gotten the phone call from the woman, the funeral home had also gotten a strange call from a man claiming to have known Roland Owen. He offered to help pay for the funeral, but the funeral home said it was already taken care of. But the man said, "I would be happy to pay." And obviously, the funeral home was like, "We can't pass up that opportunity." So the man then sent $25. That's crazy. The man sent $25 to the funeral home in the mail, but he did not give his name. $25 for a funeral? I'm going to do the conversion and see what that is in like now because that would be nice, right? I would love to pay $25 for my funeral. This is where the timeline gets a little, especially for this part. When I read it, I was like, I don't understand this timeline. Anyway, so the caller to the funeral home, the man who had originally called the funeral home, gave another theory that Owen was engaged to his sister and Owen had cheated on her. And the caller said Owen hadn't played the game fair and cheaters usually get what's coming to them. This clue came in after his letter was received with the $25, and it was discovered that the same caller had also sent a floral arrangement for the funeral, and one of the arrangements included a note that says, "Love forever, Louise." This is where the theory that Roland Owen was murdered from a scorned lover, and this theory still bleeds into what people believe about this case today. Okay, so now I'm going to backtrack again and talk about his real identity. So, in autumn of 1936, a family friend of the Ogletree family was looking through a local newspaper when she came across the article of the murder and the unidentified man at the Hotel President. She showed the article to Ruby Ogletree. She saw the sketch of the young man, and things started to fall in place for her. They traveled to Kansas City and reclaimed their son's remains and put him to rest finally, but they were still receiving letters from someone still claiming to be Artemis. The final letter was mailed from Bombay, India, and contained details that were all completely false. In the summer of 1937, a suspect that police were pursuing in the murder was finally identified as 36-year-old Joseph Ogden, who was previously employed as a cook and a dishwasher. After arresting Ogden on unrelated charges, the police stated their belief that Ogden had been the mysterious man dubbed Dawn. So Ogden was found to be also involved in another grisly murder, and this further solidified the police's accusations towards what he had done, possibly to Ogletree. There's another suspect that came up, and this theory mainly only comes from Ruby Ogletree, who is Artemis's mother, but his name was Joseph Simpson, and he was one of Artemis's earliest travel companions when they left Alabama in 1934. Artemis and Joseph made it all the way to Los Angeles before allegedly going their separate ways, but Ruby did not believe this and suspected Simpson had some kind of involvement in her son's murder. She found it odd that Artemis left with Simpson and the two had split up for an undetermined amount of time. Simpson also never tried to reach out to the family after it was discovered that Artemis was murdered. There's a lot more that I could include in this, but it kind of just messed with my timeline of things. And it's just like little details that I don't necessarily think are productive for a conversation for this video. So there's no other information. This case has never been cold. It still puzzles a lot of true crime people and detectives. And I think they're still looking into it in Kansas City, but I think it's very unlikely that they're going to solve this case. But thank you for joining me in another video. I won't be posting next week, but hopefully by the first week of November, I'll have something super special. I'm really excited to share that with you. Thank you for watching. Have a great day. Bye.